Well, Bob, we thank you for joining us today. And Bob, your story, you have so many stories to tell us. We have such a short period of time. If it's okay with you, I say we jump right into it. And I wonder, you were born in Berlin in 1922. Can you tell us, start us off by talking about life in Germany before 1933, before the Nazis came to power?
Well, of course, I was a kid. I just grew up. I didn't understand the political ramification of the lost war, World War I I'm talking about, which Germany had lost. But personally, it didn't really affect us. My father and my parents were middle class. Well, my father was a doctor. My mother was a housewife who never went to university. She just raised me, but life before the Nazis was difficult, but not impossible. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is simply that Germany, for the first time, had a constitution, and if you want to know more about it, see me later. But Germany never had a constitution because the emperor was running the show, and now they had, and we were, maybe I should say I had no siblings, no mother and no brothers and sisters, and the story I was told why this happened, that when I was born and my mother took her first look at me as a baby, she said, "Oh my God, enough is enough," and let it go as that, and she meant it. She never had a brother, never had a sister. I was the only child. I grew up in the 1920s. None of you was even, your grandfathers are living at that time. So it was a time where Berlin was recuperating from a lost war. It was a very vibrant city, a very lively city, and I grew up with a normal kid growing up in a big city, and nothing special. But there were things which, is it all right for me to mention the Holocaust, the radio?
Well, yeah, because do you want to go when Hitler was appointed chancellor and talk about how things changed?
That comes later.
Okay.
I just wanted to tell you my first acquaintance. You got to excuse us. This is we are old friends, so we don't hate each other, even if we interrupt each other. But now the reason I mention it is that I'm a kid. I grew up. I know nothing about politics and so forth. But you know, there is something in your subconscious which begins to nag on you. Now, let me explain what I mean by this. I have a Jewish mother, and I have a Jewish father, and obviously I was Jewish. And that in the beginning didn't bother me very much. My parents, and that might interest you to know, they were more German than Jewish. Like I say to other audiences, we were, first of all, my parents were Germans. And secondly, they were Germans. And thirdly, they were Germans. And only then were they Jewish. So you see the priority there. And I grew up with the idea that Germany was a wonderful country. It may have lost the war, but basically it was a not only landscape-wise beautiful, it had a culture, it had a entertainment, it was a very vibrant city, which of course I couldn't enjoy. I was just much too young. And yet, you know, ladies and gentlemen, when I think back 75 years, then I remember things which are today. Now, normally I ask the audience, but you guys are smart, you know the answer. What was the means of mass communication in the 1920s? I give you two. I give you the first one, which were newspapers. What's the second one? Ma'am, any idea what was mass communications in 1923? Radio, of course you all knew that. Radio was what TV is for today. It was a means where people could buy a cheap radio, get the news and so forth. And me, growing up in Berlin, listening to the radio, which my father had on constantly, he was very interested in the world around him, including politics. I heard things which disturbed me. And those things were anti-Jewish. There was a man out of the loudspeaker, with my father's radio, about the Jews having caused the loss of World War I. The Jews signed the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, it went on and on and on, and I went to my mother and said, what's Dad listening to? And my mother said, don't you pay any attention to him. If your father, and that's a quote, ladies and gentlemen, if your father is dumb enough to want to listen to some politician who sits God knows where, between you and I, he sat in Munich, and he was making anti-Jewish speeches. And my mother, in her own way, tried to calm me down. She knew I was upset. She knew that I knew I was Jewish, and why is a man constantly harping against the Jews? She said, don't worry about it. And she made a famous sentence, which to this day sits in my mind, and she said, you have nothing to worry about. And she explained in her own motherly way that we lived in a democracy, that Germany now has a new constitution, and that we are protected by the police, and the best thing I can do is not to worry. Don't pay any attention what your father gets out of the radio. You have nothing to worry about it. And now I want to do a jump. What happens?
And now you're talking, so Adolf Hitler is appointed chancellor in 1933, exactly right. And you're 11 years old at this time.
Yes.
And life changes.
So I was 11 years old when something so drastic, so enormous happened that it took years for the world to understand it. What happened is a simple administrative act. The Nazi Party was the largest party in Germany. Our very, our very old and senile president had no choice. He needed to appoint the leader of the party as the Chancellor of Germany, and his name was Adolf Hitler. And I just mentioned Chancellor. This is why I like to talk to adults. This is why I'm grateful you're coming. I don't like to talk to 8th graders. Not that the kids are not smart, but if you say Hitler became a chancellor, they haven't got the vaguest notion of what a chancellor is. But you do, and so I don't have to explain that. Anyway, Hitler suddenly, at 11 o'clock on the Saturday, he became the chancellor. And with this, remember my mother's famous word, you don't have to worry about anything, we are protected by the police. All of this went out of the window. It is almost difficult for me, 70-some years later, to describe to you Americans born and raised in a free country, not a perfect one, but at least a free and honest country, and to explain how literally within 24 hours, life changed so drastically. And with Hitler as a chancellor, he could now implement the very thing my mother had told me, don't you worry about, you have nothing to worry about. Now we had something to worry about. Hitler went into politics with a one major objective, and this is to destroy the Jews. In those days, we're talking about 1933, but he didn't talk about killing, but he talked about eliminating them from the economic, the scientific, the arts, wherever Jews were, they are to be eliminated from the German life. And guess what? He did. He did with a bang. I mean, life is difficult for me to describe. I don't know anything about your hometown, nor do I need to know. But imagine your hometown suddenly having signs all over. I usually go and ask somebody what his favorite sport is. I'm sitting a little far away, so I'll skip that. I asked, and the guy said, football. So I said, football. American football or German football, known as soccer. And he said, European soccer. And said, what do you need to play soccer? Well, the kid looks at me and said, I need a ball. I said, yes, you do. What else you need? I need goals. I need 2 goals, one on each end of the field. So what's the big problem? Well, the problem is that the Nazis decreed that no Jews could play on this field. We were eliminated. My favorite sport in those days when I grew up was swimming. I just loved to swim. The problem? Do we have no water? No, we had plenty of water. What we didn't have was a pool where the water goes in, because the pool had a big sign saying no Jews should swim in this pool. And so it went. The city went from a very sophisticated, modern city into an absolute abyss where everything was bad. Jews were something which the Nazis detested and wanted to eliminate. In the 1930s, when Hitler became chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, don't worry, you're not going to get a test on it, but just remember 1933, that's when Hitler came, and within months, he had radicalized what we call today, we had radicalized the German people. I still, being as old as I am, cannot understand how a German educated people, sophisticated people, could suddenly fall for a rebel rouser. Of course there is an explanation, but guess what? I don't have time to give it to you because I have more to tell you. So just take my word for it. It was a city, Berlin became a city where Jews were not wanted, where Jews were disliked, where Jews were chased away. There were places all over we used to go with signs on it Jews not wanted. Just give you one example. Where we lived in an apartment. We didn't have enough money to buy a house. We lived in an apartment on the 3rd floor, no elevator, but we had a home. And on the bottom, on the street where we lived, there was a little ice cream parlor, just an ordinary ice cream. And we kids used to spend our pocket money in that ice cream parlor in summertime and enjoy their merchandise. Now they had a big sign suddenly, "We do not serve Jews." I don't know how many of you, let me see your hands, have already been upstairs.
Probably, a few.
Yeah?
And probably just a few, and more will go up after they hear you speak.
You will go upstairs. Let me, if I may, alert you to something. On the 4th floor where you will arrive, there is all sorts of dynamic exhibits. And among them is a very small television screen, which has nothing spectacular about it. It has no music, it has no marches, it has no flick, it has no anything. It was just a rolling band of information on the 4th floor. And the reason I mention it, because to me, this is one of the most devastating exhibits in that whole museum here. Why? What did it show? Did it show murder or anything? No. It just had words written in it. And that little screen, if you take a few minutes to stand there, listed all the anti-Jewish laws that the Nazis passed where we were. Let me give you some examples. 1933, Hitler came to power. 1934, the year during a big rally in the city of Nuremberg, the Nazis released some laws which were mandatory for the Germans. One of the laws which they released during that festival in September of 1934 was they took away our citizenship. Now, think about it. All of you have or are entitled to probably American passports. The American passport is derived from your birth in America. You're an American citizen. And with that, you have the rights and privileges of an American citizen. We, my parents, had the rights and privileges of a German citizen, which included, of course, all the civil rights. With one stroke of a pen, in September of 1934, only 1 year after Hitler came to power, they took away our citizenship. Hitler declared that no Jews, regardless where he was born, that no Jews could be a citizen.
And Bob, and I know that through this time, right, the Nazis increasingly put in these restrictions that in 1938 really culminated in a pogrom that targeted the Jewish people particularly.
From that time on, after our citizenship was taken away, the screws were tighter and tighter. That screen I was telling you, you cannot imagine the things the Nazis permitted. We weren't allowed to have a pet. Can you imagine that? We were not allowed to have a dog or a cat. We were not allowed to have an automobile, not allowed to have a telephone, not allowed to have a radio, and so forth. And the Nazis were bound and determined, and to some degree successful, is to eliminate the Jewish people from the life in Germany. Let me give you a figure, which I don't mention very often. Germany in those days had 65 million people in the 1930s. How many of those were Jews? 500,000. That was the entire, and those 500,000 became, to quote Adolf Hitler, an eternal enemy of Germany. Those 500,000 people were bound and determined to destroy Germany. So you need to do this trying to understand. It's difficult, I agree with you, it's very difficult to understand, to lead a life where you are an outcast. And you're an outcast simply because not what you did, but what you are. And there's a fundamental difference. You are, in my case, born as Jewish, and therefore you are bad people. Let me just do one thing. Most people think that the Germans were so anti-Jewish because of religion. That is not true. I don't care who tells you that. Religion was not the reason. Why? Because you can change your religion. You can go to a priest and say, "Father, I would like to become a Catholic." And the father will take you, teach you, and make you a Catholic. The Nazi philosophy, what they hated about Jews, was their blood. And that was a difficult thing to change. You don't change your blood. You were born with bad blood, and therefore you were a bad person. So you get an idea of the life you're living. People hate you, people don't like you, people don't want anything to do with you, simply because you got bad blood. Now, put that in your pipe and smoke it. You see what it is.
Well, and I think you're gathering here, even from our short conversation, we could be here for the rest of the week, I think, hearing about so many different aspects of what you experienced, and there's not enough time. In 1938, this violence against the Jewish population was expressed through an evening of violence that targeted shops and businesses. Can you tell us how that event, Kristallnacht, affected your family in 1938?
Well, you're going to give me another 30 minutes?
Yeah, I know.
I know you're not going to do that. You want to get going. What happened is, in essence, there's a lot more behind it, but I'll tell you that privately after the show is over. What happened on that, at that time, in November of 1938, that a Jewish fellow shot a German embassy official, killed him. And the Nazis used, there's a long story behind it, but we just simply don't have the time. Anyway, the Jewish fellow, and that happened in Paris, France, the Jewish fellow shot the German embassy official. And the Nazis used that assassination of the German official, who was, of course, a Nazi, and they used that occasion to have an enormous time of destruction. That was a time when the synagogues were burned. We lived not far away from one synagogue, and I could see some of it. They put fire, they took the holy scripture of the Jews, throw them on the floor, made the Germans walk across. They told the firemen not to extinguish the fires in the synagogues, let them burn. Just be sure that the Christian buildings around it are protected. It was but what is mostly concerns me individually is that that same night, the night from 8 to 9 November 1938, they arrested 30,000 Jews. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. You go to the concentration camp. They had not done anything. They had not broken any laws, nothing, but they were Jews, and they had bad blood, and they needed to be punished for something which happened in Paris, when a total stranger shot a German embassy official. That's what my father had to pay for, and he was put in Buchenwald concentration camp. And it was very difficult. I may have omitted to tell you that my parents got divorced, so it was my mother remarried, and I had a stepfather. But the arrest of was my real biological father, and he was the one who went to the concentration camp simply because he was Jewish, simply because that meant he had bad blood, and simply it meant we need to get rid of him. And so we had to live with the stigma of the bad blood. And from then on, things, if we thought that things between 1933 and 1938 were bad, they got a lot worse. Everything we liked, everything we enjoyed was forbidden. We weren't allowed to go and see a movie. We weren't allowed to go and go to theater. We weren't allowed to do anything. You became embraced by hatred when people didn't like you. And so...
and there was also during that period, after Kristallnacht, maybe in 39, where you experienced forced labor, where you had to start...
Well, personally, the Nazis found laws or established laws which made life even more difficult. For example, they initiated a rule that anybody between the age of 15 and I think it was 65 had to go and work. And the way this works, it's not that you work in order to earn a living. That was not the Nazi purpose. They wanted free labor. We had to report. I was, 17 years old. I had to report to an office every morning, and they assigned you work which you had to do. Usually labor, heavy manual labor. I remember two things I needed to do. I got a sack of coal and had to bring them to the building where they had central heating, from the truck to the building. And but the other one I was much worse. We had to take bricks and bring them to a construction site. We didn't have in the 1930s all those trains you see today. In those days, there was manual labor who brought the material which the masons needed by hand, and Jews were the one who immediately did that. So, and then something happens. I'm going to jump now.
Please.
And that is, anybody know what happened in September of 1939? Thank you very much. Yes, there's one word.
Invasion of Poland.
The war broke over. The Germans marched into Poland in September of 1939. Why they did this and how they did this, I really don't have time to go into this. Suffice it to say that the Germans marched into Poland, and the free Polish country was suddenly a German colony with all the laws, and they had enormous amount of Jewish people there who were now all settled with the anti-Jewish laws which the German Jews had already experienced for a number of years. And so but you know how people are. Let me give you my parents, my stepfather and my mother, when they heard that the Germans marched into Poland. They also heard read in the newspapers or heard from friends that the British and the French told the Germans, if they don't get out of Poland in 24 hours, we're going to be in a state of war between Germany and Britain and France. And of course the Germans didn't get out, and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 3rd of September 1939, we were at war. And my parents were happy. Oh my gosh, I remember them. They were saying that is the best thing that since green grass that we were at war. You will see and I was wondering, I was old enough to understand, but I didn't know why they were so happy about a war. And he said, well, because the British and the French will destroy Germany, and 6 months from now, Hitler will be history. Well, you know, and I know, and she knows that it was just, Hitler began to win every battle. And by the time in 1942, 80% of Europe, 80%, were all German occupied, whether it was Greece, Bulgaria, it was Hitler began to win everywhere, and it was won. Our life became considerably worse. For the first time, I was hungry. Before that, there was always enough food. But now that the war had started, we had ration cards, and potatoes were rationed, and bread were rationed. And the Jews got some ration cards. But if the Germans got 4 eggs a week, the Jews got 2. If the Germans got 1 pound of butter a week, we got 250 grams. And so it was a time where we began to physically suffer. Before that, you suffered mentally. But now you began to also suffer physically. It was very bad.
And you mentioned 1942, and again, so many stories. I'm gonna, if I may, move us in 1942, July of 1942, things got worse for your family. Your family was arrested.
Yeah, in 1942, my family, the Gestapo came and arrested all of us. It's a very, they didn't come because we were Jewish. That's not why they came. They had good reasons. What happened is that my mother helped somebody escape from Germany. That was a thing punishable very harshly than if you helped somebody to escape. There were only about 3 or 4 neutral countries. Everybody else was involved in a war. And it so happened that my mother knew a priest who lived in the area of Constance. And if you look at the German map, you see that Constance is within spitting distance of Switzerland, which Switzerland, of course, was neutral. And so, to make a long story short, that my mother had an address, and she gave that woman the address. The woman made it to Switzerland, sits down, writes a postcard, and writes on the postcard on the bottom and says, if it wouldn't be for you, I wouldn't be here. I'm free and I have beautiful sunshine and life is great, okay? Of course, the Gestapo reads that and said, aha, Mrs. Behr is the one who helped that woman escape to Switzerland, and here they were. And so in July of 1942, they came and arrested all of us. Now, at that time, the killing in the gas chamber has already started. The killing of the Jews in the gas chamber started in 1941, a year before. All my relatives.
Oops, that was your cane.
Well,
Oh, here, I'll get it.
well, you have to help me.
Here we go.
All my relatives are killed. The deportation started in 41 when they shipped the people to Auschwitz and gassed them. And so by 42, it was already standard practice. But we were not sent to Auschwitz to the gas chambers. Neither my father, my stepfather, my mother, nor I. The reason for this was very simple. Since my father, my biological father, had been a volunteer for the emperor in 1914, they would not gas those the veteran and or his relatives. So we were saved by the very fact that my father, who, when he volunteered for the emperor in World War I, had no idea that he would save, that this action would save our lives. Of course, it was years later. Anyway, the bottom line is that we were not sent to Auschwitz. We were sent to a little town in a country that doesn't exist anymore. It's now called Theresienstadt, and the city is called Theresienstadt, and the country is the Czech Republic. It used to be Czechoslovakia, but that's another long story. It doesn't exist anymore. And so here we were suddenly in a concentration camp. Now, there are tons of books written about concentration camps. Some were bad, some were worse, some were impossible. And it was suddenly you are taken out of, just take yourself out of your normal life. You go to work, you fix your dinner, you lead a normal life. In the concentration camp, there is nothing normal because you don't have anything to say. There were tons of Jewish people in that concentration camp, but the power rested with 7 SS guys. Those 7 guys ran the show. Well, couldn't you? No, you couldn't, because they had weapons and we had nothing. And so those 7 SS guys ran a show of 60,000 people. Now, permit me to give you a couple of words about the 60,000. Theresienstadt used to be an Austro-Hungarian garrison town. Well, Austria-Hungary didn't exist anymore. Then it became Czech after the Treaty of Versailles in 1918. It became part of Czechoslovakia that didn't exist anymore because Hitler occupied it in March of 1939. He took the freedom of the Czechs away, and so that whole area was free for the Germans to do what they want, and they did, and they made a concentration camp out of it, specifically for older people. people over 65, and some younger people who were especially deserving. And we were especially deserving because my father had volunteered to fight for the emperor. That saved my life because it eliminated the gas chamber for my family because of the action my father took when he volunteered to fight the war and had no idea that years later it would save his life. Anyway.
And conditions were quite hard, but there was an opportunity there was a work opportunity that came up. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I can. What happened is that the war was going on. The Air Force, the American and the British Air Force were bombing the hell out of Germany. Berlin was hit very badly. And among the building which was hit was the headquarters of the SS, the very people who are bound and determined to eliminate the Jews. Their headquarters was totally destroyed. I can give you the address, wouldn't mean anything to you. And so the leader of that SS, a guy with the name of Heinrich Himmler, went to the German authorities and said, hey, the Americans destroyed my headquarters. I need an office. And can you give me a piece of land? And to make a long story short, the Germans gave him a piece of land and saying, here you can build yourself a new headquarters, usually barracks. And then the guy said, thank you, that's what I wanted. And then they came to the Theresienstadt, to the concentration camp where my family and I were, and said, we need some volunteers to go there and build that guy a new headquarters. And then they added a sentence, and for that sentence is the reason I'm sitting here with you, because they said, if you volunteer to go to that place where they built the new headquarters, if you volunteer to go, we will not evacuate you. Now, in parentheses, everybody knew what the word evacuate meant. It meant death. It's another long story, you have to come back. Anyway, everybody said, if you're going to be evacuated from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz, that means they're going to kill you. So I volunteered. And they said, we will not evacuate your folks. I thought, well, that's my chance to do this. So I volunteered, and that was the worst time in all these years since 1933 that I experienced. It was so bad, so hard, so difficult, that for the first time, I gave up. I was willing to die. I got very sick. It was 1944, bitter cold in winter, and 1944, I had a vitamin deficiency disease called impetigo, and then it's accompanied by high temperatures, and you feel just about as bad as you can imagine. And I didn't want to live anymore. It is now 44. I had it for 11 years already that I lived under this Hitler with my bad blood and no chance to ever get out and so forth. The war we knew, but we didn't have any details because the Jews were not allowed to have any means of communication. So I was standing on the barbed wire fence. One that was either late November or early January. I don't really remember. I think it was early January. And anybody who's ever been to Europe in January knows that can be pretty lousy weather. But we were standing there in the inside, the barbed wire, and we looked out, and there was another guy and there was a Sunday, because on Sunday we didn't have to work, and what we saw out there was something very unbelievable. We saw a huge truck of people with every kind of movable furniture, wagons, baby carriages, anything. And these people were going outside the concentration camp. God knows where they were going, but it wasn't very difficult to figure out, and I'll tell you in a minute. And I looked and I asked this colleague of mine, the prisoner who was with me, who are these people? He said, well, don't you see, those are Germans. Well, yeah, they're Germans. But I don't have all the time in the world, but I will tell you what was remarkable was where they're going and where they're coming from. These people who were outside, who were German nationals, were going from east to west. Now, did that mean anything to you? So let me explain this to you. In 1941, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, and the Germans occupied, marching from west to east, occupying. Now, all of a sudden, these people which we saw walking, they were going from east to west, towards the Americans, towards the British, towards freedom. They didn't want to be captured by the Russians. And the guy who explained that to me and said, don't you see, the Germans are fleeing from the Russians. They're going from east to west, from Moscow to Frankfurt, and like that. And I thought by myself, you know what? Maybe you ought to live a little bit longer. If it's that close that the Russians are already coming, chasing the Germans away, then maybe the war will be over very shortly. And in closing, I can tell you, yes, that was, we were evacuated from our concentration camp in probably February 1945. We were returned to Theresienstadt, to our base camp, and on the 5th of March, the Soviet army liberated the camp, and we were suddenly free. My parents, due to my volunteer work, survived the concentration camp. They died shortly after, but at that time they were still alive. So my volunteering to go there saved their life. And the war was over, and we were free. And that's the story.
Hey, Bob,
I have to tell you.
I wonder if you can, and you mentioned your biological father who was forced to flee Germany in order to get out of Buchenwald. Mm-hmm. At the end of the war, he ultimately ended up in the United States, and at the end of the war, you tried to reconnect with him. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the war was over. It was 1946 when President Truman arranged. See, I don't have time to explain to you the American immigration law, which is not a very good law. It's a pretty bitter law, lots of restrictions. But anyway, during the war, it was almost impossible to go to America because they had a new rule. Roosevelt had a new rule that every German Jew needs to have a sponsor. Well, a sponsor, that's a guy with a family who is responsible, let's say, for the Behr family, if he came to America, from soup to nuts, everything, whether it's medical, education, you name it. And to get a sponsor was the only way you could get an authorization to come to the United States. Well, I went to the embassy, the American embassy, in about 1939 after Kristallnacht, and tried to get them persuaded my mother and I and my stepfather could go to America, but we didn't have a sponsor, and so that fell flat. So, what did you ask me?
So your father made it to the United States, and at the end of the war...
My father got, I think I told you, on Kristallnacht, he was one of the 30,000 Jews who got arrested, put in a concentration camp, and he got out. And the way he got out is that it's not the Germans who stopped him from getting out, it's the country to letting them in. And he was lucky he got permission to leave for Cuba, and he did.
Great. So we're going to close the program now. There's never enough time to hear all of the stories and experiences you have. It is our tradition in first person that we always give our first person the last word. So in just a moment, I'll turn back to Bob for his final word. But when he finishes, we're going to have Joel come and join us for a photograph where Bob will be on the stage and the whole group will be behind. So we invite you to stay for that. And also, if you have a question for Bob or would just like to come up and shake his hand or say hi, please stay after and Bob will be here and you can come and check in with him. Obviously, there's so much that we didn't cover. You returned to Germany after as an intelligence officer. And there are many stories about Texas and cowboy hats and lots of things. So go online, you could read more about them. But I'd like to thank all of you very much for being here. We hope that you can come back and visit another first person program. Again, they run every Wednesday and Thursday. And Bob, I have known you now for close to 10 years. You are an amazing individual, and I learn something every time I hear you speak. And the experiences you share, I think, are powerful, and especially during this, which is the week of Days of Remembrance. It's just a real blessing that you've been able to share your story with us. So on that note, I'm going to turn it back to you for our final words.
Well, my final word is really very simple. What you see in front of you is an old, used, 95-year-old man, and who drags himself from his home to the museum to talk to you. Why do I do this? Why do I sit here instead of being in a warm, nice apartment where we live and talking to you? Well, I'll tell you, we won't live much longer. We are marked. All the people who are survivors will be gone in a short time. So who's going to take over? Who's going to be the one who's spread my story, anyone's survivor story? It's you. We are totally, utterly dependent on you. And it's a great job what you need to do. When you see something which is wrong, don't go away saying it's not my problem. If you see something, in my case, anti-Semitic, somebody who uses spray paint to write something on a synagogue, don't say that there's nothing I can do about it. And go up, have your guts and saying, don't do that, don't do that. That's my mission to you. I'm going to saddle you with a job to do, to defend liberty, freedom, and happiness in our behalf. We won't be there. Will not live that long. So if you can, and if you will, follow the lead and defend what's good and right. And that's the reason I'm here.
Thank you. Thank you.